Yum, yum!
Preview window, I can take a look at any of those render outputs while I'm working. And so we've got a material ID, we have an ambient occlusion, and this has been rendering in the background, which is why it didn't reset. So the renderer was actually rendering...
Greg Brown from Fondue showing Radeon ProRender with MODO here at the AMD booth.
And I can go and evaluate all those quickly and easily and be able to count on what my final render is actually going to look like.
Except for the standard MODO preview window, which is pretty cool. So it looks like it's integrated pretty well. We'll take a closer look at this in a second.
Now I mentioned earlier on, MODO's renderer is also capable of baking. And the preview viewport is also capable of baking. And so all I have to do is switch the renderer over from the primary renderer to the baking view, and I can actually see the UV map for my selected mesh. And while I have this running, I can actually switch over to any other mesh in the scene. And also notice, as I refine and move the mouse over the viewport, even in this UV view, it will refine underneath the mouse. Now if I switch while the renderer is actually running over to the other mesh, and let that go ahead and calculate, what you're seeing is the full final color shading on the piece of geometry. So we have lighting, shadows, we have all the various material effects, all in a final render state. But of course, I could also look at all the various other elements that you would want to, such as your diffuse shading. Maybe you split apart your indirect and your direct lights. You can split this all apart in MODO, have it render all at once, and take a look at those individual elements. So your final result is something you expect, because there's nothing worse than coming back to check out a render 9 hours later and it's not what you expected. That's why we built that. So now we have a new beta out here on MODO, and that is the Radeon Pro WX82, Radeon Pro on the WX8200. And so I'm pretty excited about this. Been wanting GPU rendering for a long time, and the Radeon ProRender is outrageously fast. And AMD was kind enough to loan me two WX8200s to test this out on. So we've added this in another new viewport, which is specific for the Radeon ProRender. You can see in the viewport, it actually lists the actual cards that are being used, and it'll inform you while the render is going, what's going on in the scene. So right now it's loading up all the geometry, and once that loads up, you're just gonna see a very complex render start to refine insanely fast. So bam, it just goes in there. And so this is a brute force render, and I personally love that. MODO's render is the CPU-based render. It's something I'm very familiar with. I've used for over 10 years, and I know how to tune it to make a beautiful render. But somebody who comes into MODO for the first time will have a difficult time doing that. Radeon ProRender solves that problem, because the settings, as you can see over here on the right side, are very simple. All I have to do is say, hey, I want this number of iterations. I want the maximum render time to be this value. And I want my ray depth to be this value, or for diffuse, glossy, and shadow. And what I've been impressed with, working with AMD on incorporating this render in MODO, is how much of a native renderer it is, or how it appears to be a native renderer. Now it is currently in beta. We have not connected everything up that we want to yet, but simple things like being able to navigate in the viewport just like you can in our standard preview renderer is awesome. Moving around in the GL viewport and having that update immediately as well. And you can see how quickly this refines. Now, I don't have the actual image of this, but I rendered it in MODO's CPU-based renderer on the Threadripper 1950X, and I also rendered it through Radeon ProRender. To get the same level of refinement on MODO's CPU renderer, it took me about an hour and a half. On the Radeon ProRender with two WX8200s, I was done in 12 minutes. That is a beautiful, beautiful thing. It's kind of a problem though, because I don't have as much time to go get coffee, and this is one of those things I definitely counted on when I was working as a production artist, was like, all right, throw the render on, immediate break, because I'm sorry, I can't do anything. So letting just a GPU do the work for you is absolutely amazing. And I love now that I can use a GPU not just for GL views to improve my working conditions in the viewport. I can use a GPU to accelerate my rendering, which is such a relief to me, because I like to use every bit of hardware I possibly can. And if I could possibly throw in 8 cards in my machine, I definitely will. Currently in its beta state, it only is supporting 2 cards, but we will be supporting as many cards as is possible. And I've gone ahead and expanded this to show the final render after 12 minutes to let you know the level of quality that we have here. You see there's no noise. Like, you don't have to go in and fight the renderer trying to get it to drop those little specks that might be here and there. Now this is a scene I threw together from some assets on TurboSquid, and it's a basic clay render. But since this is in its beta state, what we're really interested in is kind of evaluating where does the renderer break down. And this is a good example of it doesn't break down, because I have a very complex asset in a very large environment. And large interior environments are notoriously challenging to light and shade and render, because you have all these rays bouncing around this gigantic environment and this hyper detailed item right there in the center. So once this kicks up, what you're going to see is a render that is using very heavy depth of field, another thing that notoriously increases render time, subsurface scattering, and how quickly it's able to refine despite these various elements. And so this model itself was a bit of a challenge to throw together, just because I didn't actually create it, but the lighting and shading, you can see, runs absolutely beautifully. And so as this renderer continues to refine, what you're going to actually see is the beautiful subsurface, the nice depth, and that very heavy depth of field in the background, and how well it actually refines. Now, one of the things I'm looking forward to adding to this renderer, since we do want to make it, you know, almost as broad as our native CPU render, is the ability to refine under mouse, and that's another one that is coming very, very shortly. But to me, you know, coming from starting in 3D about 3 years ago, and having to render with scanline renderers, where you're like, okay, I'm going to turn a light on, I'm going to render, I'm going to go away for an hour and a half, and I'm going to come back, see how that looks, and then, you know, change the value of the light a little bit and hit render and just watch those lines cascading across the screen, to this point where I can use every piece of hardware in my machine to accelerate my renders is absolutely incredible. And being able to do things that typically in a production environment you just shouldn't do, like using heavy depth of field, I can just throw everything at the Radeon ProRender, the two WX8200s, and just let it run and end up with a beautiful render and be able to count on it being a beautiful render. Now we do have a 2D navigation mode, which allows you to lock the render so it will continue. So you can zoom in and check it out at its full resolution and see how it's refining, making certain that your render is going the way you want it to, and making certain that you don't have to do any more work, which is extremely important. And so we also have multiple render modes here. I talked about our render outputs before. This is a very basic example of these. We hope to add all of our render outputs and all of our procedurals to the Radeon ProRender. But you can see right here, I can switch over, you know, to a world position map, and it almost instantly updates, or a shading normal. And one of them that I absolutely love, check out the UV, but ambient occlusion. Look how quickly it tears through that ambient occlusion render. It's like almost like GPUs were made to do this type of rendering. And so this is the type of situation where I can get those extra maps out that are going to punch up my renders just that little bit that it needs to, and I don't even have to wait around for it, which I think is absolutely, absolutely wonderful. And so what I'm very impressed with, as far as AMD is concerned, is how across all their hardware over the past 2 years, they've accelerated every aspect we need accelerated in MODO. The WX8200 performs beautifully in our real-time advanced viewport. The Ryzen 1950X absolutely kills it in our CPU renderer, and the WX8200s are outrageously fast when it's actually applied to the Radeon ProRender. And you can produce deep, beautiful renders like this that come out absolutely flawless in 35 minutes or so, which a render like this, even though it's very simple shading, all the elements that are technically challenging refine outrageously fast. So very excited to use more of AMD's products and can't wait to see what they're doing in the future. So thanks so much. Stop by our booth, ask anybody about MODO. We'd love for you to check out a trial. The Radeon ProRender is in beta for current MODO users. Thanks a lot. Have a great day.
All right, Greg here from Fondue. We're at the AMD booth at Siggraph 2018. We have Radeon ProRender going on MODO here, MODO 12, 1 or 2, I'm not sure which one it is, but the ProRender beta is coming out really quickly, and this is the first time I've played with it. So I've got, you know, it actually looks like they've integrated it in such a way where it's very similar to the MODO render. Got our own ProRender tab here, but the preview window looks just kind of like regular preview. You can navigate in it, you can select materials, it looks like. Maybe the material selection's not in yet. I've got just a basic brushed nickel material here, and a basic plastic material. We'll try glass in a second. But you're just using the standard MODO materials, so if you want to change out to gold, you can do that, make it shinier, you know, whatever. Which is pretty cool. There's gold, plastic looks like plastic. Maybe let's try one more. Duplicate this guy and get a glass material in here. Reframe my camera a bit. Actually, let's do the glass sphere.
Oh, really?
In Los Angeles together on like movie sets.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I'll introduce you in a minute.
Oh, that's awesome. All right. Small world. We got some Hollywood extras hanging around the booth here. So it does look like deformation is how, so I'm just scrubbing the MODO timeline, and I would just have an animated bin deformer, and it updates immediately. So it doesn't seem like, I'm not sure, you know, how complicated this gets. Maybe if I subdivide this a couple times, but it doesn't seem like there's hardly any of a delay between getting those vertices from different frames into the GPU for rendering. It's pretty quick. Just do that's a simple test. We'll just hit one more level of deformation here. And that's quite a few. You got 500,000 polygons, and it's still instantaneous. Oh, not instantaneous. A little bit of a delay at 500,000. 500,000 is a lot, though. Character typically most MODO users are not going to have an animated character of 500,000 polygons.
And in hardware, it schedules multiple compute and graphics workloads through the pipeline at the same time.
Nice.
So even if the GPU is really pegged on a background render, you can still work freely and very interactively in another application at the same time using the same GPU.
So what you're telling me is if I'm rendering, I can watch a YouTube video.
If you like.
I'm not saying anybody ever does that.
No.
Especially when the boss comes in, you can all tab back.
No. You can either
down low as possible.
Yeah. You can either screw off or continue working. It's your choice.
All right.
We like to give you choice.
Nice. All right.
Yum, yum!